Hi, this is Michael Becker, and in this episode of the Identity Nexus, I am really excited to have with me today Paul Olivier Douay. He is the CEO of Hestia.ai. He's also the founder, as well as the CEO and founder of Personal.io, and has been a leader in this emerging space of personal data and identity management, and really how do we give individuals agency and control over not just their identity and not just their personal data, but the role of their digital self when we contribute into society. So I'm really excited. Paul, thank you very much for joining me today, or us,
Well,
I should say.
thank you for having me. Thank you.
And I've known Paul for years, and we've been bouncing around the industry for quite some time. I first met him back several years ago at one of the My Data conferences, and we got to do some work in understanding the ecosystems of the personal data economy. And in that time period, he's been developing several pieces of fundamental technology that's contributing to the industry to help all of us, industry individuals, industry groups, cohorts, governments, etc., to really wrap our heads around this idea of personal data and how we can leverage it for the greater good, if you will. And that's what really drew us in today, is to be able to have a conversation, because I met and caught up with Paul and his team about a month or so ago at the My Data 2023, and I got an insight into some of the new work that he's been doing, and just got super excited about it. I'm like, Paul, let's get on a call. So with that in mind, we're gonna, over the next 20, 30, 45 minutes or so, we're gonna dig, and we'll see how it goes. We're gonna dig in, and Paul's going to introduce himself, and he's going to talk about Hestia and Personal.io and how these pieces work together. We'll then give some examples of some of the fundamental use cases and capabilities that are being built on their fundamental technology that Paul is bringing to market with his team, namely DigiPower.academy, and then a use case that he's doing with Uber drivers, which is incredibly interesting. We'll then roll out of that discussion into kind of what's happening with ad tech and the whole space of marketing. And then we'll conclude our conversation today with the future of work and regulations and what's happening in the personal data space. So super excited about the conversation we're about to have before us. So Paul, let's just jump right in and start with agenda number one. I mean, who are you? What brought you here? On your LinkedIn profile, you're noted as a slayer of Cambridge Analytica. So I want to know more.
Yeah, so thank you, Michael. Yes, so I'm interested in data ecosystems, in making them more understandable to professionals, but also to the general public. And indeed, I guess my big success was in helping uncover the Cambridge Analytica scandal and being really at the forefront of that effort. Some of you might have seen the movie The Great Hack, which follows an individual, an average Joe, David Carroll, who is really seeking his data from Cambridge Analytica. So that became a Netflix movie, and so I was helping him get a hold of his data. And my own trajectory around this has been a bit complex. So it's always a bit complicated to present myself, because along the way I've realized there were all kinds of problems and a need for solutions, and my approach to it has been so far to build organizations and to build technical solutions to answer that, a bit of both. So yes, I'm now the CEO of Hestia.ai, which is working, as the tagline says, on sustainable data solutions. And personal data solutions, but also enterprise data. But before that, I've been the founder. I'm no longer the director. I'm the founder of Personal.io, which is a nonprofit, working specifically on personal data. And now jointly, this nonprofit and the for-profit company, we're working on this project called DigiPower Academy, which I'll present partly today.
Yeah, and just to correct myself a little bit, I was referring to it as Personal.io, and I'm correct myself, it's Personal.io. So thank you for that.
Yeah. So the IO stands for in-out. It also stands for Indian Ocean. That's the top level domain name. But like many startups or projects, you get the IO, and that gives a bit of an edge in and on the technology side, but it actually stands for in-out, which is quite appropriate to what we do because we help people get their data out of existing systems into new ones. So
You know, it
that's
also kind of looks like the power symbol of the on-off power symbol.
right. Yes, that too. Yeah,
Turn
you
off,
get to
turn
shut
on,
off
turn
what
on.
you don't like, and you get to
Yeah, turn
activate.
off what you don't like, turn on what you do like, that kind of
Yeah,
that,
yeah,
that kind of idea
exactly.
as well.
So
Um,
not everyone gets it, but I thought that was pretty appropriate. And Hestia actually, do you know who Hestia is?
no, no, please explain. Sure.
Hestia is a Greek goddess, is the goddess of the hearth, the place where people gather around the fire to discuss. So
Ah,
it's also in the logo. There's this fire in the middle, right? And then people around the fire are like those blobs discussing, linking around the fire. In Greek mythology, it's also a metaphor. A metaphor. The fire is power. It was stolen by Prometheus, so it's the power that Prometheus tries to steal to give to the people. So this fire here is data, artificial intelligence, all of those things. So Hestia is really
fantastic.
the place for people to talk about that power, which is exactly what we're doing now today, right?
Yeah,
So
I love the different thinking along that idea. I mean, my company name, Identity Praxis. You know, praxis is the whole idea. Is the Greek terminology for putting theoretical applications and theory into practical applications. So, you
yeah,
know, similar root. Yeah, I wanted to take identity theory and make it practical. Like, and how do we do it?
yeah. So millennia, but still relevant today.
Yeah, exactly. And I do want to, before we move on to the next piece, I think this idea of your point of sustainable data solutions is really critical, because when we talk about this idea of personal data and this idea of identity and the attributes that roll up into our personal data, we often then think of the individual. This is Paul,
Yeah,
this is Michael Becker. But at the end of the day, an individual is both an individual, it's a group, an enterprise is an individual too. A company is an individual that has its own sustainable data needs. A government is an individual that has its own sustainable data needs, as is a thing like an IoT device.
yeah,
IoT devices will increasingly be able to make their own and have their own identities and make their own data collection and ins and outs of data, and increasingly because of AI and their own informed decision making. So
right.
all of these are individuals when we talk about the sustainable data solution. That's kind of my preamble. What's your reaction to that? Do you agree, disagree? Where
No,
things go with
totally.
that?
I mean, so maybe starting with personal data IO again historically. So personal data IO's tagline is to make individual data rights actionable and collectively useful. So there is this dimension of individual and collective, even though it's in relation to personal data. So that's the first thing. And then on the sustainable, obviously nowadays when you say sustainable, everyone thinks about ecology, but more broadly, you can think about the environments that surround people, that surround entities. And I've chosen that term because from the realization that the biggest companies in the world right now are some of the least trusted companies.
Mhm.
So these for certain things, maybe for their security, but maybe not for their business model, right? Maybe they're trusted for security aspects, but for business models, they become more successful as they circumvent all kinds of expectations that people might have. So there is a paradox, there is an ambiguity there, that those companies are starting to surround us, to be part of our environment, but that environment is being less and less trusted, or we can trust it less and less. So I question really the sustainability of a lot of those business models long term, just as an individual, but I also spot there an opportunity long term as an entrepreneur.
Right, and that's really the foundation of what we're about to talk about and such. So, do you want to give us a brief history? I believe on kind of where we're at and how we've gotten here.
Right. So it's maybe not an actual history, it's kind of a fun thing, right? So this is a mid-journey prompt. So it's generative AI. The prompt is on the right. Draw me a hero embarking on a scientific expedition across the ocean in the 17th century, carrying all kinds of scientific equipment. So why am I doing this? Because I conceive of what we're doing as um, in a continuity of effort of understanding your environment. And I'm a scientist by training, so I really think about this aspect of exploration of data ecosystems. So this is the images it generates, kind of fun, right? The ocean, the 17th century.
So
The jungle.
let's go back. Let's go back real quick too, for those that may not be familiar with this. So Mid-Journey is something like ChatGPT or OpenAI. It's a large language model AI engine.
Yes, so you prompt it with text and it generates images, and it usually generates images in this quartet of image, right?
Okay.
So 4 different ones, and then you choose the one you like, and then you guide it a little bit. So
Yeah,
I just
I
took,
just wanted to make sure we were centering people on what
yeah,
they're seeing. So when you say a Mid-Journey prompt, it's not like it's his journey on it's his
no,
hero
no,
journey.
no, 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 no.
It's
The
an
prompt of the
AI
machine is
system
called Midjourney,
that
yeah,
you're entering in this prompt, and these are
yeah,
the visuals we're seeing.
right, which are actually nonsensical, right? On the top left, you see this guy riding like this barrel, but it's kind of evoking the thing. So this is the same jungle, the 18th century, um, the mountains in the 19th century. So, okay, it's kind of cool. I mean, I like the instrument of the guy on the top left. 20th century space, yes, looks like images we are starting to be more familiar with, maybe. And then the big question to me is like, what does it look like an exploration? Let's explore data ecosystems in the 21st century. What does it look like? And then it's kind of fun to see that, okay, they have all their tooling and they're ready to explore, right? Well, Hestia is kind of, the way I think of it is that we're building what's in those cases. We're building the tools, right? And so what are the tools like? And that's my vision of what the tool is. And actually, this is really helpful to explain it. So what you see here is some kind of combination of a telescope, a microscope, and all kind of lenses, allowing to explore data ecosystems. All right. So I think this combination is quite key for what we're doing. There is a scientific element. You can see it on the left. There's some sort of map with a telescope that gives you the big picture, but at the same time, the microscope that gives you your own microscopic picture, right? So in this ball of Earth with billions of people, you're just one of a few billions. Well, we try to give you a good sense of what your data is like, but we try to also relate it to the big picture,
Well,
right?
and it seems like too, there's like little add-ons and little things you can be adding into the equipment, and then there's nodes that one can be drawing upon. Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah. So, but the fact that this gets, at least, in your head, you have this image now.
Yeah.
Then I can suggest all kinds of things to you. I can suggest, like, imagine what if I put many telescopes side by side, and you sort of go see at all of them at once, kind of with like a compound eye, like an insect, right? You could see into the data of many, many people at once,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or what if I allowed you to go see your own data, but in many places at once with a common map? So you could align all of it, your own personal data to that big map. That's more
Right.
like
Well,
data kind of thing, right?
yeah. And what I like about that, I was actually talking to Ted Goranson, who's a famous hypertext knowledge worker from for the last 40 years or so. And he and I were talking about the relation between set theory and category theory the other day, and how early hypertexting issues are now coming back to the forefront of modern language. And that, if you think about, the common relationship of data, this object to that object, and these objects are related, when we're making those relationship links, we're only thinking about this is linked to that. But when we think about here's object A and here's object B, in the category theory model, what we're starting to learn is, well, how are those things linked? So that, item A and item B might be linked in 10 different ways. It might be, think about one person linked to another: friend, parent, family, employer, employee. It's not just the fact that these objects are linked, but the nature of the link and when they were linked, and the label of that linking alone could end up just creating an enormous number of insights. And I think that's where we're trying to learn. We're starting to explore more and more as we dig into our own individual personal data journeys, but actually those that we have with these broader ecosystems, aka society. The link types that we have associated with each other are creating a tremendous number of insights.
Yeah, so I'm glad those conversations are happening. I mean, I'm a mathematician by training. I spend 50% of my time easily thinking about category theory, actually.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, so what you just described is there's so much theory that's coming out now looking at those things. So the indeed what you described is called a co-span. How do you attach meaning to those co-spans? How do you put extra information there? Beyond just describing sets of relation types, like
Yes.
you were saying, you can also start asking what are the relations between those relation types and what kind of new functionalities you can add there. You can also ask, how does that compose? What if I could see, some systems database and add new annotations on those relations, new services on top? That's kind of what we're trying to do as well. So,
Oh,
yeah.
fantastic. I didn't realize that we would actually have that connection, but that's pretty cool.
Yeah. No, I mean, I could grab probably, like, if you give me a minute without moving, I could grab 10 category theory books around me. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So okay. So with all those lens. Oh, and by the way, a few things. So the word lens is also a category theory word. Lenses and optics have technical meaning. Also, they are composable, for instance. That's also really important in category theory. If you imagine, Canon, they're building bodies for cameras, but they're also building the how do you call the lens, right?
The lens, yeah.
Yeah, the lens part. And you can compose the lenses. You can put a lens and then another one and then another one. So this composability is really important. You can wrap a lens in the sense that you can put filters between them and insert that along the way. And then you can do all those weird flows that I described, where your eyes looking at different places, so you can assemble them in different ways. Yeah.
And again, to your point, that's really what, frankly, the likes of the big tech players are doing at grand commercial levels. And essentially what we're trying to do a lot with these data models today is to democratize them, really, is to allow the individual to have that same power and basically combat the asymmetries of power between, say, big tech and the individual. Once individuals can collaboratively create a cooperative, both individually and as groups, to be able to have the similar power of their data. It's like what Elastigirl says in the movie Incredibles, your identity is your most important asset, protected at all costs. Individuals need to be able to, have those powers. And again, let's be very clear what we mean by identity. Identity is nothing more than an individual identifier and or sets of attributes about me that roll up to become my digital or physical, recognized identity in society. So having control over one's data in the way that we're talking right now is just incredibly important.
Yeah, I mean, your identity is your relation to the starting point of your relation at every single locus in the ecosystem.
Yes.
At every single point. So I have a slide where I will explain a bit more of that.
Awesome. So with that backdrop, let's jump into it. So you've got two basic, so you've developed quite a bit of technology, but we're now going to go through and you're going to demonstrate two kind of use case experiences that have been built on that technology. One being the Digital Power Academy, which is an academic environment where we can all as individuals join in and explore our data. And then the other one is more of a commercial one where Uber users have been leveraging their data.
Right, exactly. So if you go to digipower.academy, which I do here, well, the value proposition is pretty clear. You get to analyze your data. And what we did is we built a ton of experiences, what we call experiences. So they're like those data scopes that I described before, this combination of microscope, telescope. And so, you can go and you can look at all kind of different sources of data that you're likely to use. Maybe you use, more than 50% of those services, Michael. But some of you might be interested.
I call about almost maybe 90% of them.
Yeah.
And I actually at one point or another I've used them all, but I've stopped using some of them, like TikTok, because I don't want my data out there, right? So
Tinder?
No, or Tinder, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So for instance, here I go and I explore Google Takeout, which may be badly named. It's more like Google Semantic Location History.
Now,
That's one
and
of
just so we're clear, you've gone to Google Takeout and
Right,
you've
sorry.
downloaded a data set about yourself, and they
Yeah,
give you
so
a zip file.
anyone can go to takeout.google.com and can go and request their data. So I'm not going to do it right now, but you could select things, which data sources you want, and then you do an export, right? So we give some instructions on where, like here, we give instructions on what's interesting to request. But specifically over here, so there's 51 different services, but I'm only interested in this one.
Right.
Location.
And then you download that as a zip file, which
Right.
is a compression of all of that data. And now you're uploading that back into the service.
Yes. But actually, in this case, I'm not going to upload my own data. I'm going to upload a sample data set.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
we
Some
sample
synthetic data. Yeah.
So the viewers can go themselves and they can check it out themselves. That same data set that I'm about to use.
Yeah.
Right. And then this runs in the browser, right? So if I had brought my own data there, it would not go to the central server. This all runs in the browser. So the data was delivered, the code was delivered to my browser, and then is running on data that I've not really uploaded. There's no good word for this. I've just dropped it in the browser.
Well, and I think this is really important. And let's just pause there. So right now, I'm not uploading my data. In this context, you're saying you're not uploading the data into some central server where I'm now losing control of my data. You're
Exactly.
uploading. If I were to be using this myself, I'd be uploading my data into a session in the browser, which is privately protected within that session.
Yeah.
So that when I close the tab, all of the data disappears.
Exactly.
And it's not being stored centrally anywhere else. I am in total control of my data in this situation.
Exactly. That
Okay.
promise will be not broken, because we will go a little bit further at some point, but it will be clear at that moment that this goes a bit further, right? So, so this is happening. So I'm here in Lausanne, in Switzerland, and this is describing the places that that account has visited. Now, people know about this because they can go to timeline.google.com, a different service. I'm not going to show you that one because it will show you my location, right? So, but you can go to timeline.google.com. People are familiar with that. But we take this data that is returned by Google, they actually return more data than you might expect. And we create those new tabs that describe the data that is delivered. So for instance, this one is fun. We called it Other Candidates. And it's basically Google telling you back, well, here, I think you were at this address, at this restaurant, with 41% chance. But actually, you might have been there as well at this bar with 2.8% chance, right? So Google is telling you a bit more. It's not just telling you, I think you were there for that period, but it's also going to tell you, and those were the other guesses around where I wasn't quite sure.
And I think this is really important for people to understand, in that when Google's like taking your phone, you've got an app on your phone, Google's estimating your location based on where your phone has been. It's making some probabilistic guesses based on the data that it's getting available. That's what we're seeing here, correct?
Yeah, exactly. It's probabilistic. And it's telling you both the sources of signals and the result. Okay, and there is several different signal types that you can use. You could use GPS, but that's actually not very common. It doesn't work inside, for instance. It's battery draining, all of that stuff. So it could use GPS. It actually uses mostly Wi-Fi. So hearing Wi-Fi routers helps locate you, right?
Yeah,
Which Wi-Fi?
For those that might not be aware of that, so every Wi-Fi router has an IP address. That IP address tends to have a physical location. So if you connected to a Wi-Fi router, that can be used as a location signal.
Right. So it uses actually the MAC address, which is really hardware specific, and you don't need to connect. You don't need to connect because the routers are broadcasting where they are, and your phone is just constantly listening.
Correct.
Even if you have deactivated Wi-Fi on some phones. On some phones, depending on the manufacturer, even if you have like toggled the Wi-Fi off, you think it's off, it just means it's not emitting, but it's still listening, right? Still listening to broadcast signals. And so this is used. And then there is another sign that is used, which is, so we can select it here. It's searched address. So if you have searched an address before going to the place, that will also be used as part of the sources of signals, right? So that will affect the inference, which is really fun because you can control it, right? So you can go to a place and intentionally, before you go to the place, before you go to a cafe and you spend an hour there, you search the business across the street. And in this way, you can see that the signal gets split, basically. The prediction gets affected. So I talked about scientific instruments. We're doing this. We're actively training people to go in different places and measure this confusion we can create in Google's mind, if you want.
Okay, that's super geeky, but very cool.
Yeah, it's super geeky, but it's like, it's as if, you know, we go beyond the microscope and we start doing like in vitro fertilization or something. We have a microscope and we start like manipulating those micro data. And so it's a scientific, it's building scientific instruments, right?
Yeah, fabulous. So, okay, so this is giving us as individuals the ability to download our Google location data or location data from any source and upload that into your system.
Yeah. So just so you see the Wi-Fi signals, this is, for instance, you know, there's this famous street, anyone who has been to Lausanne knows it, right in front of the train station, because it's basically like this. So it's very steep. But if you walk from the train station to the top, you get tracked. Like your phone hears so many signals along the way, so many Wi-Fi signals. And so you get tracked like very, very minutely. Okay, so that's the individual. That's about like an individual understanding their data. And as you said, it touches on many different sources of data. We also have this concept of data spaces that we use to, it's kind of like a pop-up data space, you know, like you would have a pop-up store. So we have pop-up data spaces where we can create a space temporarily for an hour for a training. And that's where the value proposition changes a little bit. So if I go there, I'm in the participant data space. I can go to, I don't know, the LinkedIn experience. I do something similar, explore this sample in this case, then go through the different tabs that show me how I'm being targeted with ads. When I build connections over time, you know, I'm a Tuesday user of LinkedIn versus a Sunday one, whatever. But then at the end, I have the option of sharing the data, right? And there is a real consent form. There is a real effort of explaining to people what they're about to share. There is some options to select and deselect different things. And then you can share it with the group, right? And the idea,
and the group in this context could be a class.
It's just a class.
A class
it's just,
at a university or a industry workshop.
Yes, that's all we have had the interest in trying so far. But the class can already get pretty complicated because what you can have is also like a scaffolding of, if you have the right class, if your topic lends to it, you can really have a class where the students help design the entire ecosystem. So this group of students will work on that app. This group of students will work on that app, but they all share into different partial pools to explore different apps, right?
So I see. So the class can be built around, we're going to go, you know, you have to use this app, you have to use that app. In 2 weeks, we're going to come back together and upload our data.
Yeah.
And then see what's happening.
So, or the reality is more like, you already use this app and you have used it for years. Are you okay to first week one, you just use it to learn yourself about your own data. It happens in the browser.
Yeah.
It's very easy to deploy in a classroom, as long as not everyone is behind the screen of the student. So that's okay. And then we talk about the process where we'll be like limiting what gets shared, and it's only about building a common picture. So it's not really about the individual. The data gets blended between multiple participants, right? And that gets shown on the screen for an hour. It gets erased at the end, right?
So let's take a step back and pause right here then. So the Digital Power Academy is a service, a free service that's out there that anyone can use and come and join.
Yeah.
Now, is there any commercial model around it all in terms of pulling groups together for like classwork and things like
Right.
that? How does
So
that work?
Good question. So the tools here, the individual tools are freely accessible. It's also open source, so it's freely accessible. I should have said on the grouping aspect, it's end-to-end encrypted. So it's between the browser of the students and the browser of the teacher.
Yeah.
It's hosted on Hestia servers as an intermediary measure.
Sure.
Encrypted. We don't have the key if the teacher has generated their own key, right? And yes, there is a commercial model that's not really working, to be frank, to be honest, which is around hosting the infrastructure for those classes where the pooling happens.
So think about it, it's like a pop-up session, right? I'm a
Yeah,
teacher.
a pop-up session.
I want to host a pop-up session. We post it up and we do where, I'm the teacher, I've got all the keys, you're the students, you can import your data. As the teacher, I can see all of our data. We can now.
You can see only the filtered data.
I can see the filtered data
level,
right
at the aggregate level. So there's some very tricky mediation of it. Like, for instance, if you share your geolocation data in a town, which is really interesting to see if how we get mapped, if it's different between Michael and Paul, right? We can decide, or each of us can decide, to only pool data that has been visited by K people.
Interesting.
Right? Where K is decided by you. Each of us.
All right. So we don't have all the time in the world to go into all the nuances of that aspect of the business, but I'm so happy you shared this with us. So we've got in the DigiPower Academy, I as an individual, anybody listening to this can come on for free, download our data from those different services, upload it, and start exploring our own digital footprint, our own digital exhaust. To the extent that we have any professors or academics or professionals at a company that wants to say, hey, let's learn data together. We can come in and pop up this DigiPower Academy model. Let's not talk about the specifics of the business model yet, because you might change those. So we don't necessarily want to memorialize those in a recording. They can come to DigiPower Academy and learn about those business models.
Yes, I mean, you can. I should have said, so DigiPower Academy is a joint project with personaldata.io, this organization. So you could see it as one deployment for them of this infrastructure, right? We have another deployment, actually, which is at respectmedata.fr. This is the website of the consumer organization, the biggest consumer organization in France, called UFC Que Choisir.
Okay.
It advertised in Paris, like those on the right, those are ads in Paris for that website, which is kind of cool.
So that poster on the kiosk is an ad for this?
Yes. So you see the logo is kind of similar, right? And here it's the same. So people go there and they can also explore their data. It's in French, obviously, but yes. So Hestia is deploying for those use cases if you want.
Got it. And you said it's open source. So in theory, someone could download this and deploy their own version of it open source, or how does that work?
Yes. Okay. It's licensed under AGPL, which might be an obstacle in some businesses, might not be, but we can always discuss those things.
So again, to that business model, though, we can come to you and say, hey, can I stand up an environment like what you were just showing us?
Yeah. And see if you're more interested in the teaching or research aspects, because you can also go beyond the in-classroom teaching. You can do like long-term research, right? So if you're interested, for instance, in social media, how do young people use social media? That data is very interesting for that purpose. So another good person to talk to is Jessica Pidou, who is a researcher at Sciences Po in Paris, who has been using it extensively in her classroom and who is also leading the association that I mentioned, personaldata.io. And
right.
I think
so you founded Personal Data.io, you brought Jessica in to help lead that so you could go off and do other things.
well, so I could focus kind of, I mean, I'm still doing, I could focus on the technical parts where I
Right.
feel like
Right. You needed her to go run the initiative. And again, we'll hopefully connect with Jessica and bring her on for future episodes, and we'll
Yes.
talk to her in more in depth about all of this and how it works.
Yeah. So, but she's also very relevant for one of the use cases. So, if you look back here at the bottom right, you see that there is an experience for Uber drivers, right? So I'm not an Uber driver. She's not either, but we've been working for a very long time in convincing Uber drivers that we should work together in building such things, such experiences. So we have done that, and that was really helpful for building this other thing, right? So the DigiPower Academy, the fact that we had like a teaching element to it, that we could approach Uber drivers and explain to them what data Uber had about them, was very helpful for what I'm about to describe. So I've been doing this all over Europe, even the US for a while, talking to Uber drivers, telling them about their data, the importance of it. But to really make progress on it, I had to wait for the issue to come to Geneva, where I live. So by the issue, I mean something that is kind of sweeping through Europe, which is the fact that Uber's treatment of drivers has been inadequate in light of existing regulations in Europe for years.
Well, and in
So
the United States, there are cities that are mandating minimum employment. So, for example, if you didn't get so many rides within that hour, you're going to get your $19, $18 an hour income,
right.
Because you have minimum employment hourly employment rates.
So this gets really complex, but it's an interplay between federal level laws around work regulations, right? And more local laws around transportation. Sometimes local authorities have some leverage over Uber to impose certain things. So what you
for example, my area is San Francisco. So if you go federal, state, city, the city of San Francisco can apply its own laws on Uber and what it's allowed to do within San Francisco.
Exactly. So here it's a bit the same. At federal level in Switzerland, there was a highest court judgment that Uber drivers had actually been employees for 5 years. So what does that mean? That means that potentially these employees can go and they say, well, there is minimum wage, there is overtime, sick pay, holiday pay, all kind of different nighttime, Sundays, all of this. So your expenses, the car should have been
healthcare,
right? So you owe me this much, right?
Now, and let me pause you right there too. And again, I don't want us to take us too far afield, but there's also this idea that it's my car, it's my phone, and my capital asset is the one generating the data.
Right. So that's Uber was built on top of the risk of buying the car is offloaded to the driver, right? But in that, okay, that's their model. But the data is also is also a tool of production. It's not just about the car. It's also this is Marxist language, but it's kind of true. It's the data is part of the equation, is part of the leverage that Uber has over their competitors, their city, the whole market. And so that data has been, well, the driver has been distanced from the data they have produced, basically.
Right. So in many ways, it's like in the turn of the century, the factory worker would go into the factory and build whatever widget they were being invited to build on behalf of the manufacturer. But now the factory is me. I'm not having to go to the factory to build something. The 21st century factory is me just living my life and driving my car.
Yeah. And this is really good because the worker entering the factory is also punching.
Yes.
Right. So stepping in, saying
time stamping in, time stamping out.
Now I'm giving my time to my employer in exchange for salary, basically. Yes. Right. That's the bargain. And there is some form of contract, and then there is some form of pseudo contract, which is the punching to mark the
Right.
time.
And labor unions were built up around the fact that factory environment needed to be safe.
Yeah.
And that my labor rates would be equitable amongst other factories and relationships.
Yeah, and labor unions have a tough time because they are defending collective interest, but also the individual in some circumstances. And
Yeah.
there is a free rider problem around the fact that even if I'm not part of the union, I might benefit from the existence of the union. So why would I join? You know, all of
Right.
those things. So yes, this is also present in relation to data, and it's especially present in the relation of data in the context of work.
Yes.
So the situation that was in Geneva was that there was this new judgment. So now all kind of the drivers were wondering, should I go to court? Should I accept the settlement that the canton, so kind of like the state, has forced Uber to offer? So there were lots of questions. And the lawyers and the labor unions were trying to advise the drivers, and all they could say was like, this is really complex, this is unprecedented. Take screenshots. You have to take screenshots to help us assess the thing. Now, a driver is driving 3,000 rides, around 3,000 rides a year. They might need to take one screenshot per ride because that's basically their only access to information they had. And this is for 5 years. So it's completely unpractical, right? And then we came in and we're like, with Jessica and with a few others around us, we came in and we're like, GDPR, so the General Data Protection Regulation. Uber is based in the Netherlands. They're subject to GDPR. So just send this letter. Just send this letter, which was like 10 pages long, lots of legal language saying we need this, and that. We had practiced this for years before, so we knew it was possible to get it. We had the plausibility that it might work. So we started like telling the drivers to access their data. And,
okay, and let's pause right there. So under GDPR, as well as under, I think now 5, soon to be 6 states in the United States, we have similar personal data. We'll generally call the personal data or people-centric data regulations, which has a classification in it called the data subject access request.
Yeah.
So you essentially now legally can go to these businesses and say, give me a copy of the data you have on me. Is that that's what you're referring to?
Yes, that's exactly right. In the US, it's a bit more fragmented. There's also some sectoral rights, like the FCRA, COPPA, HIPAA.
Health.
Yeah, all of those laws have the right of some form of right of access to data. It's generally scoped to personally identifiable information, which is much more narrow than in Europe. In Europe, it's personal data, which means in the European understanding, data about an individual. Right.
Yeah. So and again, just for those listening, so like we have educational rights, children rights, healthcare rights, employment rights, and then the general personal data rights, as you talked about. But it's not just personally identifiable. It's in the Europe, it's becoming more and more any data produced by or about me. And then there's some new regulations that are coming on, which I'm really personally interested in. Any data generated by about me, but also by and about my things. Meaning data generated by my IoT devices is my economic asset, not yours.
Yeah, and we're jumping maybe a bit ahead, but it gets also even more complicated in the context of companies because it's also data generated
by employees,
by my suppliers, by my suppliers as a company, by my suppliers when I do business. And sometimes I do business around people like my customers, for instance, right? So there's all kinds of new data flows that are being imposed, potential data flows when people know about them, basically.
Yes.
Right. So if people know about their rights, or if companies know about their rights, they might leverage those flows in new original ways.
So let's summarize before we see the next screen in this use case. So in Geneva, there was this use case. All of these new laws were built around Uber drivers now have rights, potentially economic rights, social rights to their data, and that they could then take their data if they actually had enough insight into really what their behavior was. They could go and sue Uber, not just as a settlement of what Uber wanted to settle with out of court, but actually to show, no, Uber, my real value of my data was not worth, I don't know, I don't have the right numbers. Hopefully you'll tell us in a minute, but for the sake of the setup, my real data is not worth $1, it's worth $100. right?
Right.
And I
So it's
actually now
more,
have the data to back up that assertion.
yeah, it's more like 5,000 was the offer, 5,000 euros, $5,000.
Yeah.
It's more on the order of 50,000 that they could claim, right?
Right.
So
So,
we,
so in your case, so there was a legitimate number. Uber saying I'll settle with you for 5,000 euros.
yeah,
And are the analysis that you've done based on individual Uber drivers' data coming up into a cooperative was saying collectively our
well,
data is actually worth 50,000 euros per driver,
not yet into a cooperative. This is an individual
but
step,
just on an individual basis. Okay.
right? So 50,000, yeah. So a multiplier of 10. It's not just the multiplier of the amount, it's also like the solidity of your file, of what you're filing. It's not just words, but it's also data evidencing it, right?
Undisputable data.
Well, it's data coming from Uber. We
Yeah.
can check it. We can check it also. We can confront it with other data we have to see if they've lied, for instance. We don't think they have lied, but we can check, right? So that's substantial. But yeah, it's on the order of 10 times more, and it's maybe like 20,000 euros per year of work for Uber, and you can go back 5 years. So we're talking serious amounts. The problem is that this money will come in years,
Yes.
right? So it's settling now versus a multiplier of 10 in 4 years.
Yes.
And they don't have much capital to actually take the risk of losing it.
Yeah.
You don't
I'm
have
sorry.
like,
They being the individual Uber driver doesn't
right,
have the capital to actually go
to
and
court.
file these lawsuits and manage this process to hope at some
Yeah,
point in years later getting a 10x return
yeah. The
versus
worst case,
settling today and getting 5,000 euros.
the court system is favorable in the sense that the worst that could happen to them is that they lose the money they've paid their lawyer.
Yeah.
As far as I understand, they wouldn't have to pay the expenses, or they're pretty sure they wouldn't have to pay the expenses of the other side, like in the UK, for instance. So in that sense, it is favorable, but it's still a risk of spending a lot of money for losing everything at the end.
Okay. Now let's be really, neither of us are lawyers. So
Yeah.
let's now that we're starting to talk about legal stuff, let's be clear.
Yeah.
We're not lawyers. We're not advising any lawyers. We're not doing any of that.
Oh, no, I'm advising plenty of lawyers on
Well,
the,
on the data side of it, but we're
the
not
data
advising
aspect,
people on
yeah.
the law side of it, right? We're
Yeah.
not lawyers. We're not, now, having said that, the reason why I wanted to preamble that in the US, we actually have a really interesting model called the class action, which
Right.
I don't think is really applicable in many other countries, where a lawyer can develop a class, say all Uber drivers in a particular region, and then that we can aggregate up that class, and then that lawyer would then represent the whole class of those thousands of or tens of thousands of Uber drivers and
Right.
in mass in a class.
So I know there's a lot of audience in the US to this. So let me say that in Europe there is something coming called the Collective Redress Directive, which
Okay.
is a directive which will get translated into national laws, and it's basically setting up some form of American-style class action system around different states. Right now, it's very big in the Netherlands, which happens to be the headquarters of Uber, but it's coming to different countries, one after the other. There is no culture yet of putting a lot of money up front for building a case that might get a tenfold return in court. No strong appetite yet for investors in that space.
In Europe.
But in Europe.
But in US, there's
In Europe,
absolutely that culture.
yes, I know. But this is a real problem of access to justice. Like here,
Yeah.
what I'm saying here, this 5 to 10 to 50,000, this is huge multiplier, and it is a real and concrete, and I would say fair.
Well, and it really
access.
fundamentally comes down to the asymmetries of data and insight.
Yeah.
And again, let's assume, for all intents and purposes, that the data I download from Uber as a driver is in fact accurate. It's not been tampered with. It's all legitimate. The fact that Uber comes to me and says, "Here's 5,000 euros," but if I don't have access to my data, it's called the asymmetries of data. Uber knows more about this than I ever will because I'm not a data scientist. I'm just a driver, right? If they're getting me that settlement with me not having a tool like this to really understand whether or not that settlement is worthwhile or not, and justifiable or not, there's that asymmetry of effort. And so I very well could say, sure, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But until I have this tool, I really won't know.
Yes, and this tool is going to be complex, is going to be scoped country per country because it has to do with labor laws.
Yes.
But this is where we need some innovation, is that underlying this tool is access to data. And the access to data is still not complete. And the access to data is Europe-wide.
Yes.
All of Europe, in the country where there are no class actions, in the Netherlands. So this is very unifying for many different fights. It's a fight around access to data that is underneath the fight for defending data, labor rights.
Yeah, and again, we could continue on this forever, but I think there's a really interesting additional anecdote that could be put into here is I could download my data, but where does my data go? And there's a new and increasing complement of tools called the Personal Information Management System, or what my data would refer to as the Personal Data Operator, which are tools and services that will allow me to not just asynchronously or episodically download data and pull it into a system like what we're seeing here in these demos today, but actually have that being done for me in real time, all the time.
Continuously, yeah.
Continuously. Yeah. So I'm an owner of my data set. And so then at some point in time, we could then be collecting, here is the data that I've been collecting on myself with these tools now for years. And we can give several, Citizen Me is one example, Miko's another. I mean, there's several of these operators that are out there in the marketplace. And I bring those up because those are the first that come to my mind. I mean, there's well over 57 that I've been tracking that we could actually be labeling as personal information management systems. There are hundreds if you want to get into more layers of that. But I could see an example where I could say, here's the data I've been collecting on myself for my purposes over time. I then do the data subject request. And then at that point, I then could actually do an audit. Here's what I think I've collected on myself. Here's what you say you've collected on me. If it matches 100%, great. If not, why the difference?
Yep. Exactly. Right? Or you could take it from different sources. You can complement, you can patch the knowledge together to gain better and better knowledge.
Yeah.
But here, I think this picture is actually quite important because this is like the phone of 6 different drivers. The phone is some of the most individualistic devices that consumerism has brought us, right? But here they've gone through like this obscure path of options in the Uber app to all at the same time request around the table, 6 of them, their data.
Yeah.
So obviously it doesn't scale very well, but it's a step. It's a step where in French, unité de lieu, de temps et d'action. So this is like the same time, same place, same act in relation to this massive corporation. They understand why they're doing it. It's very obscure. They're one of the first in the world to do it, but it's relevant to them individually, but they're doing it together.
Yes.
And so here, there's 2 pictures. The one on the right is in Geneva. The one on the left is in Paris, where we have been working with drivers to explain to them. On the left is like doing the first step. On the right is 30 days after having asked the data, start getting it back. And Andreas, who is in the middle of the picture on the right, he was sweating bullets because the drivers around him were not doing the analysis, but they were asking him to code, to answer his questions, their questions, for instance, in this case. So they were not physically with the fingers on the keyboard, but they had a ton of questions very quickly. They were emulating each other. So they're not data scientists, but it concerns their work and they're very aware of their circumstances of their work. And
so it's becoming very personal.
Yeah, very personal, but at the same time with a lot of emulation between them, right? So you could see they were composing more and more complex requests, bouncing on top of each other, basically. Complex, but at the same time focused. They knew what they were doing. So we built this on top of like the data that we were giving back, or the view we were giving back, because we're not touching the data, right? So the view, so here at different trips in Geneva, where we could see, the pickup point, the drop-off point, the fare, all of that information. You see, this is data from 2015. So we named that usage of the tool, we named it Orcos with an H.
Mhm.
Orcos is the god of perjury. So you've said something, right? And then we come back and we analyze this data with a new perspective, basically. So here we were trying to validate the data. We saw really nice effects. This is comparing several drivers across across time. It maybe won't show on screen, but we could see that, like in August 2021, for instance, it seems like drivers were underpaid for some reason. Looks like a mistake. We could also see that around late COVID, late first lockdown, so June 2020, some way of computing the fare was changed. So instead of being actual kilometers, it became predicted kilometers, right? So the mechanism for rewarding drivers changed. So the behavior of the drivers changed. That was very hard to interpret, actually, right? So the drivers were not taking the extra long route anymore. They were taking the shortest route because they would only be paid for
The prediction. Yeah.
the predicted one, right? So, and some drivers were taking the very touristic route before, and some others were hedging closer to the actual predicted route. So that we could see.
And just so we see here, go back if you don't mind, because it's hard for me to read. The blue line is the what? The declared. And the orange line is what?
Blue line is the declared by Uber, and yellow line is the OpenStreet routing map. So
Okay.
we took a map of the city, OpenStreetMap, freely available. It's like Google Maps, but freely available. And we asked OpenStreetMap to route the route that the driver was supposed to follow, right? So Geneva has a lake, so you have to often go around the lake. It has bridges, so you don't have much flexibility in how you route yourself, right? So we were able to match quite accurately the actual kilometers that were done by the drivers, that were declared as done by Uber after a certain date, except for August 2021, where for some reason there was a big discrepancy. But that discrepancy is due to a mistake on Uber's side, right? And before around June 2020, we could see that we were matching, but only up to a multiple. And the multiple was different for different drivers. So that was a bit odd, and it took us a bit of time to understand. But basically, some drivers were accurate, but some others were driving more as declared.
Yes.
By Uber. And what the declared was, we had to a bit reverse engineer. The declared was actually the basis for the fare. Right? So before that, we had the routing distance, which we think was, well, is the estimated distance by a street routing app, right?
Yeah.
But the declared by Uber was longer because it matched what they actually drove, and they were driving not the shortest route.
Right.
Up until June 2020, where they started all to match more closely.
Interesting. Okay.
So this is quite impactful. I mean, it's like how people behave in relation to algorithms and constraints put by algorithms on top of their work life, right?
Right. And so at this level, we don't really know, are they getting paid more or less than what they actually drove, but we're seeing the reaction of the individual based on what they were being told by the algorithm.
Yeah, so we know because the blue line is the proxy for, like, it's reverse engineer from what they were paid. So it's actually the basis for what they were paid. But it changed, the formula changed at some point. So their behavior changed according to the change of formula. That's basically what we're saying.
Got it. But are we saying, like, on the bottom right one, I'm seeing the blue line above the orange line. So are they getting paid more?
Yes, because they were driving more. But once, right, so that was surprising and difficult to understand at first. They were paid more because they were driving more, and they were driving more because they were paid more.
And so they weren't necessarily going the optimal route.
Exactly. But the day Uber said, now we are paid according to the optimal route, the one our algorithms predict you should use, they started doing that.
Interesting. So in that regard, it's like what Deming used to tell me how, or what the head of Walmart used to say, tell me how someone is measured, and I'll
Yeah.
show you what their behavior is.
Yes. So
So
that's
if they're
exactly
measured
it.
by longer miles, I'll drive longer to get paid more. If I'm not measured by optimal route, I'm going to drive optimal route.
I think that there should be a lot of academics and maybe some watching that see this and are like, oh my God, this is the kind of things I need to show
Yeah.
this, this very complex interrelation between individuals and those massive socio-technical systems. And
Yeah.
that's the kind of data I need.
And so
right?
to your point, now we can re-engineer them using these tools that you're offering us.
Yeah.
Got it.
So, but the drivers were interested in like finding mistakes, but not necessarily doing research. They were interested in building a spreadsheet, like a super punch card, right?
Well,
System.
and to personalize it, like, did I get underpaid or overpaid?
Exactly. But their own case, that was the primary motivation. So that's what we did. And we did it in like the non-fancy way from a technical standpoint. We built a spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet. And that was our app, basically, right? So the spreadsheet. And we call it an app because it's not a flat thing, just a bunch of numbers. It's also a bunch of formulas.
Mhm.
So actually generating this personalized element, but at the same time, it's a formula. It's like we put a lot of obstacles in our path. Like we did it the hard way.
Yeah.
The idea was that this was already like partly programmed, so the maybe not the drivers, but the lawyers could take it up,
Mhm.
right, and could start modifying it for their own, according to their own formulas. So we're not lawyers. We're not trying to substitute ourselves to lawyers. But if it's about summing kilometers,
But we
summing,
are mathematicians and we're data scientists, so we can get that data so you can then go do your lawyer job.
exactly. So it's layers of logic. We do the logic up to a point, and then we facilitate you putting your own logic on top. And actually, one of the lawyers in Geneva, Francisco Laspada, working with another one, Fabrice Coluccia, they built another layer of logic, and they really did it like that. So maybe I shouldn't say too much, but they really like picked it up. They really did the next step, and they did a great job at it. Yeah. And so what we're calculating is the sum of distances, sum of times in the different states. That's really important. There's something called P1, P2, P3. P1 is when the driver is waiting for a client. P2 is when they are approaching a client. P3 is when they're driving a client, right? So Uber has different claims in relation to each of those time periods, whether it was actual work, how it should be compensated, et cetera, et cetera. So we give all of that breakdown, basically. Day, night, depending on the country. Oh, I should have said something really important. This is Geneva. This is Geneva data. If you go in Paris, those graphs don't match anymore because the pricing algorithm is much more complicated than just based on hour and distance. There is like all kinds of auctions going on, and the price that the client expects to pay, it's correlated to the price. So the price the client is paying is correlated to the price declared to the driver, but it's not the same.
Mm.
So Uber is taking a spread, and then Uber is taking a percentage of the declared amount to the driver, basically.
And we don't really know what the algorithm is. We're just
Right, but
interpreting.
I'm absolutely convinced that we can reverse engineer it in cities of medium size. So maybe not Paris, but a city of 1 million people with bridges.
Yeah.
Because the whole logic or several layers of logic get spread out over a city, but it's really like different components of a city. So it's the right setup to reverse engineer a lot more information faster, basically.
So to summarize what we've been talking about then is, again, so you've basically built a personal information management logic engine, artificial intelligence engine, machine learning engine, if you may. And we've implemented this into DigiPower. You've then implemented that into models like what we're going to call the My Data Uber app in this context.
Yeah.
For Uber drivers to be able to upload their data profiles that they receive from Uber to then allow us to do analysis on these different states, if you will, P1, P2, P3 states. And then that's allowed them to interpret, have I been, I don't want to say proper because that could be a loaded term. From what I paid from what I've been paid for more versus what I think I should have been paid.
Well, it has certainly enabled their lawyer to advise them more precisely.
Correct. And what you've said, based on the analysis that you've done, you've learned that there's been like this 10x,
Yeah,
you
easy.
know, easily estimated 10x gap between what Uber has suggested in these jurisdictions that they'll settle with the drivers for versus what the drivers think they should have been paid on an annualized basis.
Yeah, correct.
Okay, amazing.
So that was retrospective. That was about correcting or affecting the past, right?
Yes.
But we also, and that came from the drivers, we also built more live dashboards for them. So to give them a sense of like how they could optimize their performance, right? So that was a demand from them, but also see their revenue month per month, see at what time they make more money. Also unexpected is how much they earn per kilometer. We're not used to thinking like that, but they do. Obviously, that's part of their big expenses, right? Because as soon as there was a judgment, Uber changed their model, and so they're still not paying the expenses of the drivers. So the driver is still trying to optimize revenue per kilometer driven.
So,
right?
so if you don't mind me interrupting, did you ever see the movie Moneyball?
Yes.
Yeah. So Moneyball, this is like, for those that may not know this, it's the Oakland A's general manager at the time, started putting mathematic analytics to the trading and the scouting of baseball players, and he realized that he could actually he could use math to basically scout baseball players and and build a team for the optimal price of a player. This is basically Moneyball for Uber drivers.
Yeah. So selecting baseball players an art? Maybe not. Yeah. Maybe there's some science to it, right? So that's
so for the Uber driver, it's now putting detailed analytics as to time of day I drive, where I drive, when I drive to optimize my income from driving.
Yeah. Okay. So this is sort of now packaged as an effort with Maze, a French cooperative of drivers. Mm-hmm. So now that becomes a collective effort. It's not just about an individual dashboard. There's this cooperative, drivers working together, drivers investing together to build an alternative ride-sharing app, but also thinking strategically about data in that context. So, or reverse engineering efforts of Maze, Personal Data.io, and Hestia working together got a prize, European Union prize for citizen science, one of 20 or so projects selected. And the idea is really there's two ideas. The first one is reverse engineering those algorithms, do it as like a formal effort. And the second idea is reach out to cities and offer something analogous to the service Uber Movement, which is a view over different cities of the traffic, of mobility data, basically, generated by the drivers. So the offering to the cities is, why do you go to Uber to get this view? Well, we drivers produce the data directly and could offer for a fee a dashboard of mobility in the city, basically, right?
All right, and so let's summarize then. Basically, sorry, my keyboard's breaking on me. I'm trying to take notes here. So what I'm hearing then is we effectively then have 3 massive use cases that have come out of just this Uber. What do we want to call it? So data.power or data academy, data power academy is like our free use, the academic personal analysis and academic analysis model for that. Then you've got this, what are we calling this Uber use case or Uber modeling? Is there a name for this? Collective. All right. So then we have a collective that can be built based on your technology too. And there's really 3 use cases: the personal retrospective, the personal performance model, and now this collective insight that then can allow us to turn around and go to the city, say, hey, as Uber drivers, as this collective, we can share with you our collective data
or a view of it, a partial
view of it.
Yeah.
So to show like this is where congestion is happening. This is where people are getting picked up and picked down. And now the individual drivers, not just the company Uber, has a voice with the city on what's happening within that city.
Yeah. And if you generalize it just a tiny bit to gig workers in general, right? Then immediately you think about riders as well, food delivery workers.
Mhm.
And then the whole perspective changes once again, because what's the consequences for restaurants of this?
Mhm.
Right? You have another local actor that can see this in different ways. You have organizations of restaurants, umbrella organizations, all of those things that can interact with this as well. And there is so much to create there. It's like the potential is enormous, but one should not underestimate the difficulty for explaining it, convincing people that it's actually feasible, and mobilizing some funds to initiate those projects.
Right.
To just do it the first time. The first time is the hardest, because once you've done it, it's like it gets replicated elsewhere fairly easily.
Well, and in fact, it's really interesting. So I could even see potentially like Starbucks users or Starbucks
Yeah.
employees having a similar
Yes.
data mapping model. I mean, we're essentially empowering the individual with control, with I don't want to say the word control, but the contributions and value that can be coming from their data. And I think one of there's an interesting article I'll share with you after the fact, but it was a New Yorker article written in 2017 or 2017 about why facts don't change our minds.
Mm-hmm.
So part of the challenge we're having is, even if we have the data, all the way from the 70s, there's been data that's shown, I can show you that the facts that you're using to make your decisions have been wrong. And now that I'm giving you the real facts, neurologically, we still don't change our minds when we have the facts. And that's what we're struggling with a bit in this model.
So I would add that the model we're trying to push is mapping an ecosystem. And then, so that's clear. But then the nuance is that we're trying to map where value gets extracted from the data that flows through that ecosystem, and especially monetary value. Because yes, people don't necessarily like adopt a rational behavior in front of facts, but it helps them focus once it's about money, basically. Right. Yeah. So people are a bit more.
And again, or in this context, mapping a pain, and the pain is the loss of money.
Yes.
Or
that's the one order higher. I mean, you could map the pain of researchers who have trouble accessing data in order to do their work. There's all kinds of pain that are latent around this, that are hidden.
Yeah.
But yes. So
fantastic. Okay. So in ad tech, that brings us to the next example. Yeah.
Yeah. So now I want to talk about ad tech, and really mapping a very complex ecosystem. So maybe you've seen that picture before. Yep. Have you?
Oh yeah, for sure.
The Lumascape.
Yes, and for those others that haven't seen it, I was actually with the Luma team when they were first implementing the Lumascapes a gazillion years ago.
Right, and this one looks awfully complex, but it's already from a long time ago. I think it's maybe not quite 10 years, but something close to that. This ecosystem is so massively complex, but basically it's about attention, your eyeballs, like how your attention gets captured. People are on the right here, and they only interact through proxies with this entire ecosystem, through publishers. And this market is about attention, and the buyers are marketers. The suppliers are publishers. It could be print publishers. It could be
well, so let's give you an example. The marketer, aka the advertiser, is Procter and Gamble.
Procter and Gamble.
Procter and Gamble has the obvious example. And Procter and Gamble has 300 plus brands. Yes. One of their brands in the U.S. is Downy. It's a soap, right?
Yeah.
Or any number of different types of soaps. So Procter and Gamble will go to either one of their ad agencies or directly through some MarTech players to place their ad and have that advertisement show up on my mobile phone, or in an out of or in print or on the television or out of display.
Right.
And let me just, for those listeners, I'll give you a really great example. Not using network names, but let's say my phone has shown up at a local fast food restaurant, say Burger King, 5 times this month, and a healthier, presumably healthier choice ad like Chipotle burritos wants to advertise to me. They'll use the data that's being collected within this massive networks and say, I know this phone has been in a Burger King 6 times in the last month. So, and I know where that phone sleeps. So I'm now going to start advertising on that phone's connected TV in their house, a healthier choice to eat, with the idea that it's healthier to eat at, say, a Chipotle than it is, say, at a Burger King. And that's how all of these data points are starting to now get connected.
And that's where maybe Samsung goes in and splices an ad on top of the one that Chipotle
on my connected TV,
because they are even closer to your eyeballs than
correct.
The channel is. Yes.
Right.
But so this example is good because here you phrased it as like the healthier alternative wants to get there. Maybe
presumably
it's not,
presumably, because healthier is subjective
yeah,
too.
presumably, but maybe it's the other way around. Maybe it's like a service that's trying to play on your weaknesses. That's, or it could also be that it's, I don't know, some extreme fake news newspaper. I'm not taking political sides, but like something that's some cheap news, incorrect, playing on people's uncertainties, fears, whatever you want to call it, clickbait, whatever.
Yeah, sure.
That will be benefiting from advertisements shown next to it, targeted to people who read Vogue.
Well, yeah, and again, it's the whole Cambridge analytic, risk of political influence and voting influences and all that. I mean, forget whether or not you're left, right, middle, it doesn't matter. It's been proven that we can influence people's opinions with any type.
That's not what I was trying to get at. So that's one aspect. But the other aspect is Vogue might suggest an expensive magazine, something where you're expected to see like expensive brands advertise. You know that this space has been, paid for a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
The advertisers might care about someone who likes luxury,
yes,
but might not be willing to pay luxury prices.
Yes.
But once that person is tracked around, it becomes cheap to advertise to that same person who likes luxury on other websites that are not luxurious, that don't have the expenses to build a brand. So that means, in one way to look at it, is that established news organizations get one of their main assets, which is the brand, the reputation they've built, pumped away to other entities, right? So the middle
so the luxury brand Vogue, who spent millions and millions of dollars creating that environment of luxury, can be undermined very, very quickly. Once we actually understand and know people's intentions and ideas through these programmatic models. And again, this goes back to increasingly so, and again, from in many ways, and we talked significantly about this actually, oddly enough, at the My Data 2023 conference just a few weeks back in Helsinki, in that if you think about as people start adopting eIDAS regulatory models and the new identity frameworks that are emerging, and as people start adopting what's called smart wallets, where I will have wallets that will have my identity profiles in a way that allows me to manage and assert my identities, the individual will now become the point of engagement. So I don't actually need any of these media players anymore, because out of my phone, out of my smart wallet, out of my personal data store, I will be proactively signaling my preferences. Which these advertisers will be able to directly reach me, go direct to individual, pass all media properties. So it's one potential path this might be going towards the future.
I have a great example of this. So this is actually happening already underneath. I mean, it's kind of hard to see because you need to know where to look. But in this ecosystem here, So I don't just want to say it's very complex. I do want to highlight some structure to it. It is so complex that the individual publishers or the individual marketers have to go through intermediaries. You sort of mentioned that.
Yes.
To interact. So on this side, there's something called supply side platforms.
Yes.
Which are basically the intermediaries that allow them to interact with the rest of the ecosystem.
No, and let's define supply really quick. So when we say supply in that context, what we're saying is the publisher has inventory supply in their app. The advertiser on their website has inventory supply where I can place advertisements in my app. That's the supply we're talking about.
No, that's not quite right. That's not quite right. That's not quite right. So the inventory is part of it, but it's not the only thing that gets supplied. It's also some personal data about the eyeballs that are watching.
Well, yeah, okay. So part of that supply is not just the inventory, it's the audience.
Right.
I'm able to supply this audience. To your point, I've got this many luxury users.
Exactly. Or this specific one.
Yeah.
Or this specific one as well, right? So
the specific individual. Yes.
This is not the market for ad inventory. They're not selling like advertising panels alongside the highway. They're selling attention.
Yes.
Right. Contextualized attention with attached data to it, with some profile information attached to it, but they're selling attention.
Perfect. Okay.
So that's the supply for attention. That's the publisher side. Then there is, of course, the demand for attention on the marketer side. So those are the DSPs that are here. And well, you have a market, you have supply and demand. They meet at an exchange where the auctions happen, right? So basically, you have to imagine two hands that are seeking to shake hands, but it gets really through the supply side platform, information about the potential for advertising there gets spread to many exchanges. It's maybe like thunder, like the how do you say thunder that tries to connect to the ground, tries to connect from the ground,
or
and
lightning.
Sorry, it connects, right? So that's exactly it. But meanwhile, your data has gone all over the place trying to seek a connection, but the connection only happens in one point.
Right.
And when that connection happens, well, there is a transaction that goes on, right? The market offer meets demand. There's a transaction that goes on. Now, the really interesting bit is that, as I said, it's about attention, and it's about contextualized attention, and it's about attention about a specific individual. Meaning, maybe you went to a shoe store, Michael, you saw a shoe, you liked it, a climbing shoe, you put it in your basket 2 weeks ago. And maybe now you're reading a sports page on an online newspaper. Somehow, the two of them have to connect.
Yes.
They want to connect because that ad will be more targeted towards you, and it will be more expensive as a consequence. So everyone wants to make that connection happen, that you, right now, the reader on that newspaper of the sports page is actually the person who had put a climbing shoe in their basket on this online store.
Yep.
Right. So there is some enrichment, again, a category theory term, some enrichment of this auction, of these edges that need to happen, right? So that was exactly the category example you had. So they need to enrich it. And this happens through the data management platforms. Right. So one more thing to say here is that I can show from this thing is that you were saying there is a reconfiguration of this ecosystem. Yes, it's becoming more focused on the individual. It's actually more and more of this entire ecosystem is happening within your phone.
Yes.
That's called header bidding. So basically, the exchange is a little server running on your phone. It's crazy, but that's the way it is. So the publisher is connecting with exchanges to run little servers within your phone that will then receive the bids from all the marketers. So one of the things we did in the same spirit of eliminating this whole landscape, we built a tool that allows us to go into any Android app and detect those transactions and show them on screen.
Wow.
Right? So like an ad blocker, but not blocking like an ad blocker, except it's not in the browser, it's in an Android app, and it's not blocking, it's logging metadata about the end result.
Right.
And that we can make enter into the same frame that I described earlier around the citizen science effort of Uber drivers, understanding the flows in a city. Now we are about trying to see where financial value gets created when those flows are happening within the ad tech ecosystem.
Yeah.
Right? Does that parallel work? Do you see it?
Totally works. I get it.
Yeah. So we are all data workers. That's kind of the idea I'm pushing. It's not just Uber drivers who are working for Uber. Like, we're working for all those companies whenever we are on the web, basically reading news. And so are, like, as consumers of Uber, we're working for Uber as well, but the drivers are working as well. So the journalists, they're also working for that ecosystem, because a huge part of their the advertising revenue gets taken away by those middlemen, basically.
And to give you another parallel on this, so at the Mobile Ecosystem Forum, MEF Connects ID and Auth event in May, just prior to when you and I met up at my data conference, I organized and hosted that event with the Mobile Ecosystem Forum in London. And one of our speakers, Nick, who's the CEO of Centillion, is doing something very interesting and similar in that model, in that the market model that they're working with is the creator of a podcast, for example, the creator of content, has produced content that is drawing an audience. And that audience, in their participation with that particular podcast, for instance, is generating not only their eyeballs, but also their intents and their interests in the particular topics related to that. And the model he's working on is that data being generated between that creator and audience member is now being packaged up and sold in this model.
Yep.
And the whole market model now going forward will be, how do we actually make sure that not just in the moment of that podcast, but for all future uses of that audience profile generation, both the audience member and the creator get their appropriate attribution for having generated that data that's being used, not just in the context of the podcast, but say on my television and in my apps and in all other web experiences I may have, that's powering me to be having my attention being used.
Yep.
And that's a different model. And so I'll make sure I'll introduce you to Nick later. I think you guys will have a really good conversation.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Well, we're both helping entrepreneurs operating in complex data ecosystems.
Correct.
Right. So that's a common ground.
Yep.
But on this complex ecosystem, we can apply the same methodology as what I described earlier with DigiPower Academy or with Uber, which is to bring our data scopes to go look inside, right? So the jump of abstraction from this picture that is overwhelming in complexity is what we have here on the left. Mm-hmm. So we have a user at the bottom. The user is there are arrows that describe flows. It could be flow of attention, flow of data, flow of money. But basically, the idea is that there is an origin for that flow, there is a destination for that flow, but it goes in a loop, right? So you do something, data is collected, and then maybe 2 weeks later, maybe in a few milliseconds, that has consequences for your digital life, right? And all we can do from the user perspective with this data scope is explore the data that leaves and the data that enters.
Yeah.
And sometimes when we're like on the last line, what I described with header bidding, when we instrument the Le Temps app, for instance, we're able to dig a few steps in, but we're still limited. We can't dig the whole thing, right? But sometimes we can go back. So for instance, and so what I've described here on the right-hand side is the different lenses that we will put in, and we'll put it over different configurations. Not a single location, but different sub-configuration, different parts. Category theory language, maybe a covering of a part of the graph. Okay. Right? So we apply this lens over a covering to uncover some partial flows of information. So for instance, with the Facebook pixel, that's part of the experiences we show in DigiPower Academy. It's like how you're tracked by the Facebook pixel across basically any website or app. Same with Google Firebase, Google Analytics. The other way around is which advertisers have uploaded some of my information to Twitter. That's the second to last line, right? So, and then we have also this really interesting tool. That's the first one actually in both when we explore on the left and when we explore on the right. It's called Tracker Control. It's an Android app, behaves like a VPN on your phone, and it looks at all the traffic for all the apps that you have on your phone. So it looks at all the different third parties that all the different apps are talking to. So that's very illuminating, very fast. You see how many like third parties are present on the New York Times app, for instance.
Right.
And you can, part of our experiences allow you to see that transversely across the apps. So which third party is tracking me across, 5 different apps.
Right.
And we can also do it collectively. So that's also one of the experiences that we do collectively is like, let's all pull out our phones, let's all use the apps for 5 minutes that we have on our phone, and then let's pull all the data together. So we just get a big picture that is not individual as much. It's about the sum of the surveillance that goes on over each of us when we use apps.
Yeah, understood. And just so I understand the connection between the graph on the left and the right, for those that are not math oriented. So, the A1 column there is app. So I'm using the Tracker Control app on a Samsung device.
So maybe I repeat. So A1, A2 is sort of a role in this diagram.
Okay.
Right. And then each line represents like observing with a lens around A1 and A2, where the role of A1 is taken by, well, the entry on that row, and the role of A2 is taken by the entry on that row.
Got it.
Right. So if we look at the lens, the Facebook takeout, that's one of our experiences in the G-Power Academy, then you can basically instantiate A1 as any website or app, and A2 as the Facebook pixel. And what our experience will do is highlight, I hope you see my mouse,
Yeah,
we do. Right? So I highlight, it's really like pointing at this arrow, essentially.
Yeah, and
so
we have, and it really just shows like the nth degree to which this can grow exponentially.
Yeah.
As you have more apps on your phone and more interactions on your phones and more activities. And A3 might just be yet another element that.
Yeah, it's a whole chain. It's a whole chain. Like, And
the B2, what? And the B is stand for behavior or something?
No, it's just A and B. It's 2 sides, right? So it's a loop. It goes, they have different directions. But if you go to any website, any news sites, and /ads.txt, you'll see here a list of third parties that would be consulted as I go and visit the New York Times website.
Interesting.
So you pick any website, any news website, and you will see that there. Sometimes you don't need, it's not just news sites, like this is weather.com's ads.txt. So this is basically weather.com saying, oh yeah, for brokering my audience or my attention, I go through Morgan Stanley's account 1722, right? So this is similar. They're authorizing all of those players to act on their behalf with those account numbers, basically. Right? So they're already doing some of the work of indexing their third parties.
Yes.
And you can do the same for apps. So for instance, this is zynga.com/app-ads.txt. And you see all the different third parties that Zynga is authorizing to broker the attention of people playing with those apps.
Yeah.
Right. I'm just pick 2 examples. They are by far not exceptional at all.
Right.
Okay. So that's for the well, actually, I wanted to say one more thing about this. So that was the abstraction, but I go back to the Lumascape picture, right? So this thing that was complex, and I tried to on the right to go a bit between the full abstraction and the actual example with actual companies. So to map the roles. So you have the user, there's several advertisers who want to advertise to them. There's several publishers that will sell attention through supply side platforms. On the other side, there's demand side platforms. There's the ad exchange where the two meet, right? So this is the big loop that I've described, where they're trying to shake hands, the two parts of the market.
Yeah.
And then I mentioned the data management platforms, which are trying to enrich every step of the way to know that you had put shoes in your basket for on the brand side, on the advertiser side, right? Or on a store that works with the brand. And to be able to connect that with the fact that you're watching right now a sports page. Right? So that's this enrichment happens in the data management platform. But now there's a big question in your space, which is how are they going to figure out within hundreds of milliseconds that they're talking about the same person?
Right.
Right. So you might not, you might be consulting the website with not being logged in. You might have had some identifier with the e-commerce site that you have consulted, but your profile has been built by a brand. How do they connect that? And so there's also something called, well, you're known in all those databases with different IDs. And there's also a service called identity resolution services. That's a service type that will help to say, oh, okay, you have this identifier for the green passports, right? This is the green passport ID. Oh, I know that green passport ID corresponds to that red passport ID. That corresponds to that blue passport ID. So this landscape is overwhelming in complexity, but there's a lot of money at stake in being able to pick out in every single database within hundreds of milliseconds where Michael Baker's profile is.
Well, and in aggregate, my understanding is that a lot of money is like to the tune of around $4 trillion. I mean, it's
right.
It's the commerce, and it's all the commerce that's happening digitally.
Right. So or the first step in that commerce, the advertisement, right?
Yeah, and that's many hundreds of billions, if not.
Yes. Yeah.
I'd say $1.5 trillion by 2025, something like that. Just the advertising piece alone.
Yeah. So there is a real commercial interest. Like this space is overwhelming, but there is a real commercial interest in making the relation between the complexity of that space and you, Michael Becker, or any single individual watching us, actionable, that connection for each individual actionable within hundreds of milliseconds, if not less. So
for a brand, that could be the difference between me buying that car and somebody else's car.
Yeah. Yeah. So that problem of illuminating the landscape for an individual has already been solved, except it hasn't been solved for the individual. It has been solved for those who want to advertise to the individual.
Correct. So how are we going to solve it for the individual then?
Well, there's a very simple way. There is a very simple way. The simple way is to go ask those identity resolution services what data they have about you.
Yep.
Right. So they are in the core at the core of this ecosystem, and this is basically, you're the inspector, you're the cop, you're the investigator, and you're saying to that company, you have all the leads I need.
Yeah.
Right. The problem is that it's not that simple because those companies tend not to respect the law. So the real obstacle, which might be even harder, is explain to regulators why that obscure type of business needs to absolutely be transparent.
And so, and that kind of brings us to a kind of concluding session of our what we wanted to talk about is the future, and like what's happening with the future of work, what's happening with the future of education, employment, advertising, regulations, etc. So what are your thoughts on that?
Right. So the first link I want to say is we're all data workers. I tried to push this idea, right? So we're working for the ad tech space. Uber drivers are working for Uber, but the consumers are also working for Uber in a sense. But that dynamic will just expand everywhere. So if you look at something like GitHub Copilot, this is kind of like Uber for coders, for programmers, right? So it's this system that's assisting you, but also learning from how you're doing your work, and will progressively maybe disrupt your work. Maybe the system is not quite the same as with Uber, but the anxiety that a worker might feel towards those generative AI systems is similar to the anxiety that a driver might feel towards an autonomous vehicle substituting for their work, right?
Right,
So
and the more I drive, the more I'm training the future autonomous vehicle to be able to do my job.
yeah, exactly. So remember, with Uber, the driver still had the capital expense of buying the car.
Right.
With a coder that is coding on VS Code that is hosted by Microsoft, which owns GitHub, which is also offering Copilot, things are happening much, much more quickly. And it's not about reading a city, it's about reading lines of code, which is by definition going to be a lot easier. So it's this problem which concerned Uber drivers. I'm massively sure that it's going to expand into just about every area, because there's so many entrepreneurs right now that are pushing generative AI tools in all kind of different areas as well. So, I mean, maybe you're a marketer that is using generative AI, but that generative AI is also learning from how you do your job and progressively going to substitute. It's going to be
Well,
substitute.
and again, from the fairness perspective, if I've helped train the algorithm to then undermine my ability to have employment and to economically exist in society, that's a problem.
Yeah, so you might debate like how exactly it resembles, but I think that from an individual perspective, it's very resemblant. So there is a lot of resemblance. So I mentioned the anxiety towards automated vehicles and the anxiety towards something like Copilot or generative AI. But there, it goes a little bit deeper, because now imagine you're an employer and you have a system that performs 80% of the work automatically. Do you need someone full-time? Maybe not. Maybe you just need them piecemeal, to correct the 20% that don't work out, right? So you shift from having full-on employment with a long-term, with a contract that is for contracted hours, to piecemeal work. So that's the same shift like then Uber pushed for taxis, right?
Yeah.
It's like on-demand work, basically. So that's quite concerning, but the response is already built in a sense. The response is what we did with Uber drivers, is saying this data is part of your job, part of your production, own it, basically, control it, use it, leverage it for your own interest as well.
Right.
So that's one element. And the other one that binds pretty well to what I just said is the whole package of new regulations that are coming in Europe, especially around data. So there's the GDPR, so that has already come, and LPD, that's in Switzerland, the equivalent of GDPR. Okay, not the big thing, but there is also like the Data Act, the Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act, Digital Governance Act, AI Act. This is going to be a massively complex regulatory space on top of a massively complex operational space, like all of those data transactions. So I think that basically the only way out, the only way to know that any investment made in that space is worthwhile long term, is to invest quite a bit less money comparatively into making sense of the information environment. I mean, it drives me crazy that people have to decide now for massive investments for IT for the next 5 years, things like this, and they're making those decisions without knowing, a tenth of what I've described in their own operational area. So that seems crazy to me, but it's the reality today, it seems. So yeah, so that's the two big angles that I see as relevant in the future.
So explain to me on this last one then. So how would an enterprise, for example, use what we've talked about to improve its investment strategy for, say, the data infrastructure that you were talking about?
Right. So, okay, so the Digital Markets Act is a tool that is there to correct the market. And one big set of provisions, asymmetries in the market, right? So it's like a soft antitrust measure, if you want.
Mhm.
And one of the corrective measures is to say, when a company uses a supplier, one of those massive so-called gatekeepers, right? So there's like something like 20 companies that have been listed as gatekeepers. Then they have rights over the data they generate.
I
So to make it like quite
just like I'm generating data for Uber, if I'm an enterprise and I'm generating data for one of the big tech companies.
Procter and Gamble
Yeah.
generated data for Google because
Yes.
they have Google Analytics on their websites. Well, Procter and Gamble can say to Google, hey, I want all the data that I've contributed
Generated for you. Yeah.
that I've generated for you. So it's the same mechanic as what we're trying to push with Uber drivers, right? It's the exact same thing. Procter and Gamble is big enough to have all the infrastructure to use it and to leverage it. A smaller company will not be able to do that, but maybe collectively they can. They can group together and build alternatives. Maybe there's entrepreneurs that will step in and do that.
Mhm.
So that's part of like understanding what data we as a company are producing, any company is producing, and what leverage that offers others on them. Remember, the journalist, like that's if that informs the future of many industries, they're getting all of their pie eaten before it gets to them, basically, right? By all those middlemen. So you want to understand how you're being intermediated, what data you're producing, what metadata you're producing, and how others are leveraging it. So that's the Digital Markets Act. It's already enforced, but the obligations are rolling out progressively, with the big ones coming in March 2024. And then there's the third one, which is the Data Act. And the Data Act goes beyond just the gatekeepers. It's a much more broader applicability of those principles of rebalancing markets by making data accessible for the clients.
Yes.
All right. So it's a broader scope of applicability of the same principles.
Fantastic. And so this is a broad, so in many ways, the whole world is going to this route of data. And to your point, we're all data workers. And what are the implications of that for us individually, socially, civically, and this plays out. So do you have any more slides after this one?
No, I'm done. I'm done.
Okay,
Sorry.
good. So maybe we can let's turn off the slides then and just kind of wrap ourselves up then. So we've had this broad, extensive conversation as to where we're going with data and what's happening. And let's circle now down on you. And so in terms of, you have personal data.io, which is, more of the collective community work. You've got Data Power, which is your academic / teaching platform environment. And then you have Hestia. What are you, Paul, and your team looking for? And like, what value propositions, you're bringing this technology to the market. But what do you need and what are you looking for? And if people that were listening to this saying, this is so amazingly blow my mind, how do I get involved? Where do I get started? If is one subject. Another subject would be, if there are potential investors that are interested in you, if there are potential companies that want to do work with you, like, can you explain some of this together? Like, what do we do next?
So we have, yes, community efforts around personal data.io, training efforts around DigiPower Academy. But my focus now is Hestia. It's you could see it as like two spin-offs, if you want, of my efforts before, not quite the company, but my efforts before. And Hestia is like, our strategy now comes from the realization that we're a bit ahead of maybe the market. Everything we've tried to sell so far, people have been so happy at the result, but the sales itself has been too costly to make it really an effective product. So in a sense, what I'm trying to do now is to accelerate things even more, by taking all of those insights and all of our mathematical expertise, all of our technical expertise, and to build tools that can use the capacity to access data combined with generative AI. Because generative AI well, people know about ChatGPT and other tools, but it only works. It's only going to be really useful if you can train it on data that is relevant to you. And it's only going to be worthwhile doing if that data is fairly exclusive to you, right? Because otherwise it's going to be worthwhile doing for someone else.
I mean, what's the point of me uploading my entire data set into, say, ChatGPT, which is now on Microsoft servers, to which they now turn around and own?
Yeah, so you're just going to train their systems.
Right. So I want to use all of what we've been talking about today, but ensure that it's done in an environment to which I'm not giving it away.
Yeah, exactly. So we're building a SaaS platform that helps you do that. We see it as the continuity of what we did with Uber drivers. I mean, we're focusing the SaaS platform on entrepreneurs. That's definitely in the continuity of helping Uber drivers. So if you're a small entrepreneur, if you are starting to use tools, data, and you think generative AI could be relevant to you, we are building the process of helping you, and we're building the platform to do that. But we're also looking for more contractor relationships with bigger companies, because we also think that all of that expertise is relevant in bigger companies. And that's basically it. I mean, you mentioned category theory. Underlying everything we're doing, we're applying topos theory, which is
topos.
Topos theory, yes. So it's POS, which is completely flying under the radar, except for two things. There's something called the Topos Institute at Berkeley that is trying to push that to formalize data ecosystems, if you want. And then even more under the radar, there's efforts in Paris at the Huawei Research Center, working on applying topos theory to understand AI systems in general. So Huawei came to Paris, hired a whole bunch of Fields medalists of very high-profile mathematicians in France, basically put them in their research institute in Paris to work on the problem of making sense of those artificial intelligence systems. And some of that research is public, and that's what we're using to develop ourselves and to also build a strategy around that.
All right. So if I were to summarize then what Hestia has,
thank you,
is it's developed some wickedly cool data modeling or data ingestion tools.
Yep.
And then data modeling tools on top of that.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
And then with that, companies could come to you and say, hey, Paul, I need your team to work on these data projects for me. And let's take the open source software that you've developed, stick it in an enclave that it's now protected. And so we can, and then you can, and we'll want to work with you and our teams to figure this out to create value, like what you've done with Uber or whatever the different example. So one model would be companies could come and work with you, develop those projects.
Yeah.
Another potential opportunity here is investors interested in investing in a hot new company that wants to build out more of what we just witnessed over the last hour and a half or so we've been talking. You're open to having investors come with you and say, hey, Paul, how big of a check do I need to write you so we can do more of what we just talked about?
We can figure out something, because part of the idea is also to do auditing through data of the financials of companies. So that connects to the actual value to an investor or investing in companies. Yeah. So we would maybe see those other companies as our clients. I mean, it's kind of like the auditing that we were doing with the Uber drivers. How much are you worth, right? So it's this.
How much are you worth? I saw this great stat. I can't remember I think it was McKinsey study that said 84% of the Fortune 100 companies are actually based on data.
Yeah.
Yeah, the vast majority of these companies' value is actually in the data they have, not actually in their buildings and in their employees or.
Yeah. There's this fantastic video about airline. I think it was American Airline going bankrupt, and they had to give their accounting of, and basically they're losing money with the airline side, but they're earning a lot of money, three times what they're losing with the airline side. with the miles, with the just the currency they've created around miles, and the fact that that becomes something they can sell, right? So
Right.
they sell to others, so those others can do like promotions, whatever. And that's all data, basically.
Yeah, fabulous. So again, so as we wrap up then, in terms of a call to action for those that are listening to this, because as academically exciting as and interesting as this has been, when I've thoroughly loved it all, at some level though, we need to find a way to get people involved with you and within the ecosystem that you're building, so that we can keep these efforts ongoing. And so that's consulting projects with Hestia, that is academic initiatives through Data Power,
Power.
the datapower.academy, potential investment opportunities. Can you think of any other call to actions or opportunities
Yes.
leave behind we want to have for our listeners today?
So we're building data extraction, data auditing, data structuring tools, and the value chains on top of it. The value chains, I tried to hint at different possibilities of working with cities, working with lawyers, class action lawyers, but also working with more the financial side and working with entrepreneurs. I mean, it's very generic, but the approach is very generic and powerful.
Yeah. And again, as we've demonstrated in this call today, the tools are there. So this has been awesome. And I really hope we can have many more of these in the future, as we can dig into other aspects of each one of those different topics of data extraction, auditing. What was the third one? How did you word data? Excuse me?
Data structuring.
Data structuring. You're right. I just had a typo on my notes here. So data extraction, data auditing, data structuring, and the value chain tools. Each one of those could be whole separate dialogues that we have, but we've essentially covered them all in today's discussion, which I thought has just been absolutely awesome. And so what we'll do is we'll wrap this up and we'll share it with our audience, and we'll invite people to engage and have an ongoing dialogue with us going forward. So any parting remarks before we shut down today's dialogue, or
No, thank you. Thank you, simply. Thank
Yeah,
you
no.
for letting me share this. I know I'm very passionate about it, and I know you are as well. So it was a fun discussion.
Yeah, no, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. And from my personal note, expect several introductions coming your way from this on a one-on-one basis. And then hopefully our listeners from today's dialogue too will be able to reach out and engage us both in an active conversation.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.